There are people who move through the world carrying something they have never been able to fully explain, not just sensitivity. Everyone has sensitivity to some degree. This is something categorically different, something that operates beneath the level of emotion and beyond the reach of ordinary perception, something that has made their entire life simultaneously richer and more difficult than the lives of people around them in ways that no one who doesn't share it can quite understand. Most of these people have spent years believing something was wrong with them. They've been told they're too intense, too perceptive for their own good, too affected by things that other people walk past without registering. They've been in rooms where they knew something was wrong before anything happened to confirm it. They've sat across from people and understood things about those people that the people themselves hadn't admitted yet. They've felt the emotional weight of spaces, buildings, conversations, silences, as something almost physical. And they've learned, usually through repeated social feedback, to keep most of this to themselves. Carl Jung spent decades studying the architecture of human psychological types. His work on personality, on the unconscious, on the shadow and the self, all of it was pointed, ultimately, at a single question. Why do some people experience reality so fundamentally differently from the majority? And what does that difference actually mean? Within his research, Jung identified what he described as an extremely rare convergence of psychological traits that appeared together in certain individuals. Not just empaths in the general sense, a specific type, one that possessed a combination of perceptual depth, intuitive processing, and psychological complexity that set them apart not just from non-empaths, but from other empaths as well. These individuals did not fit neatly into existing frameworks. They defied simple categorization, and Jung found, again and again, that they had spent most of their lives being misread by others, and often by themselves. Today I want to walk you through 7 psychological signs that Jung identified as markers of this rare type. Not to give you a flattering label, not to offer you an identity to wear, but because if you are this type, there is a very high probability that you have been misunderstanding yourself in ways that have cost you significantly. And understanding what you actually are, at a psychological level, changes everything about how you navigate the world. The first sign is that you don't just feel emotions, you process them architecturally. Most people experience emotion as something that happens to them and then passes. It arrives, it creates a response, it fades. This is normal emotional processing, and it serves most people adequately throughout their lives. The rare empath type Jung identified doesn't work this way. When an emotion arrives, their own or someone else's, it doesn't simply create a response and move on. It becomes a subject. It gets taken apart, examined from multiple angles simultaneously, cross-referenced with memory, with pattern, with everything else happening in the surrounding context. The rare empath doesn't just feel sadness. They feel sadness and simultaneously perceive what the sadness is made of, where it originated, what it's connected to beneath the surface, what it means about the person experiencing it and the situation surrounding them. Jung described this as emotional architecture, the ability to perceive not just the emotional surface of a moment, but its entire structural composition. And he noted that people with this capacity frequently found it more exhausting than clarifying, particularly early in life, because they hadn't yet learned that this depth of processing is a feature of their perceptual system, not a malfunction. If you have ever found yourself understanding the emotional subtext of a situation more completely than the people inside it, including situations that are supposed to be simple, this is the first marker. The second sign is that you experience what Jung called the burden of borrowed futures. This requires some explanation because it doesn't have an obvious name in common psychological language. The rare empath type has an unusually developed capacity for what Jung identified as projective empathy, the ability to extend their perception forward in time, to feel into the probable emotional futures of situations and relationships before those futures have arrived. They don't just feel what is happening now. They feel what is coming, what the current moment is likely to become, what the unspoken dynamic in a relationship will eventually produce, what the gap between what someone says and what someone means will eventually cost both parties. This isn't mystical. It's pattern recognition operating at a depth and speed that bypasses conscious analysis. The rare empath processes so much emotional data simultaneously that they often arrive at accurate conclusions about where things are heading before they have a rational framework to explain how they know. The difficulty, and Jung observed this with considerable clinical interest, is that this capacity is almost entirely invisible to the people around them. They warn. They sense trouble in relationships that everyone else can see are fine. They feel the weight of something approaching before there is any external evidence for it. And when they're right, which is often, people rarely connect the accuracy to anything the empath did. They just remember that the empath was anxious or negative or unable to simply enjoy what was in front of them. If you have spent your life feeling the emotional weather of situations that haven't fully arrived yet, and if this has frequently left you feeling isolated in your perception, this is the second marker. The third sign is that you carry an interior life so layered that most people only ever access the outermost room. Jung wrote extensively about the persona, the face we present to the social world, and the vast interior territory that lies behind it. For most people, the gap between persona and interior reality is significant but navigable. For the rare empath type, the interior landscape is of a different scale entirely. These individuals have an inner world of such density and complexity that they have learned, often quite young, that attempting to fully share it creates more problems than it solves. They've watched people's eyes glaze over when they try to articulate what they're actually thinking. They've noticed the social discomfort their depth can produce in people who are not prepared for it. They've been called old souls, told they think too much, advised to lighten up by people who experience their depth as a kind of pressure. So they learn to curate. They select the most accessible version of their interior reality and offer that, keeping the rest private. Not out of deception, but out of a learned awareness that full disclosure creates distance rather than closing it. The consequence of this, Jung noted, is a particular and persistent loneliness that doesn't have a simple remedy. It isn't the loneliness of isolation. These individuals are often surrounded by people who love them genuinely. It is the loneliness of being consistently met at the surface when the entire substance of who you are lies much deeper down. If you have spent your life feeling fundamentally unseen, even in the presence of people who care about you, not because they lack the will to see you, but because the full version of you requires a depth of attention that is genuinely rare, this is the third marker. The fourth sign is that you process contradiction without the need to resolve it. This is one of the rarest cognitive and emotional capacities Jung identified, and it appears consistently in the rare empath type. Most people have a significant tolerance for simplicity and a corresponding discomfort with contradiction. When two things conflict, two emotions, two perceptions, two truths about a person or a situation, there is psychological pressure to resolve the contradiction, to decide which thing is true, to establish a coherent story that eliminates the dissonance. The rare empath type has an unusual capacity to hold contradiction without that compulsive pressure to resolve it. They can love someone and see clearly that the relationship is wrong for them, simultaneously, without needing to flatten either truth to make the other more comfortable. They can perceive someone's genuine kindness and their genuine capacity for harm as coexisting realities, rather than as evidence that one of their perceptions must be mistaken. They can contain grief and gratitude, anger and compassion, certainty and profound doubt, not in sequence but simultaneously. Jung considered this capacity, which he linked to what he called the transcendent function of the psyche, to be among the most significant markers of psychological development he encountered. It requires an ego stable enough to tolerate the discomfort of unresolved complexity without fracturing. And in the rare empath type, this stability tends to coexist with a sensitivity that from the outside looks like the opposite of stability. If people have frequently described you as contradictory, as hard to read, as someone who seems to hold positions that shouldn't be able to coexist, and if from the inside these don't feel like contradictions, but simply like the full truth of a complex reality, this is the fourth marker. The fifth sign is that you are a natural reader of what Jung called the shadow in others. Jung's concept of the shadow describes the parts of a person's psychology that they cannot integrate into their conscious self-image. The anger they won't acknowledge. The envy they've decided isn't consistent with who they are. The fear they've buried under performance. The capacity for behavior they would never consciously endorse. Most people are genuinely unconscious of their shadow material. They don't hide it deliberately. It is simply outside the range of their self-perception. The rare empath type perceives shadow material in others with a clarity that is often unsettling to themselves as much as to anyone else. They sense the anger underneath the pleasantness. They feel the envy inside the praise. They perceive the fear that is generating the performance of confidence. They read the gap between what someone presents and what is actually operating beneath it, often before the person themselves is anywhere near ready to acknowledge it. This creates a very specific social difficulty. You cannot share most of what you perceive without appearing presumptuous, invasive, or simply wrong to people who are not yet able to see themselves clearly. So you carry the knowledge. You navigate around it. You make decisions based on what you sense rather than what you can prove. And you develop a quality of relational awareness that can seem, to people who observe it without understanding its source, almost uncanny. Jung noted that shadow perception in the rare empath type operates as an automatic process rather than a deliberate analytical effort. They are not studying people and drawing conclusions. The perception simply arrives, fully formed, before the analysis begins. If you have spent your life knowing things about people that you can't rationally justify knowing, and if this has frequently been confirmed by how situations eventually unfolded, this is the fifth marker. The sixth sign is that you have an almost cellular response to inauthenticity. This goes beyond simply disliking dishonesty. Most people dislike dishonesty. The rare empath type has a physiological, not just psychological, response to inauthenticity in their environment. When what is being said and what is actually true diverge, they feel it in a way that is almost somatic. A discomfort that is difficult to locate and even more difficult to explain, but that is absolutely unmistakable. This makes certain environments genuinely painful to inhabit. Workplaces built on performance and political navigation. Social situations organized around maintaining appearances. Relationships in which significant things are never directly addressed. The rare empath doesn't just find these contexts intellectually unsatisfying. They find them physically draining in a way that has nothing to do with introversion or social anxiety, and everything to do with the energetic cost of continuously registering the gap between surface and reality. Jung observed that this response to inauthenticity is what drives the rare empath type toward depth in everything. They don't choose depth because they've decided shallow things aren't worth their time. They choose depth because shallowness, the performance of connection without its substance, the presentation of certainty without its reality, the expression of feeling without its actual presence registers in their system as a kind of low-level alarm that doesn't stop until they can find something genuine to rest their attention on. If you have ever found yourself inexplicably drained by interactions that should have been pleasant, if you have struggled to explain why certain environments feel wrong, even when nothing specific has happened in them, if the pursuit of authenticity has been less a preference and more an absolute requirement for psychological survival, this is the sixth marker. The seventh sign, and the one Jung considered most defining, is that your sensitivity has never been your greatest vulnerability. Your misunderstanding of your sensitivity has. This is the marker that ties all the others together and explains something that most rare empaths don't fully grasp until well into adulthood, if they grasp it at all. Everything described above, the architectural emotional processing, the perception of borrowed futures, the layered interior world, the tolerance for contradiction, the shadow perception, the cellular response to inauthenticity, none of it is a flaw. None of it is excess. None of it is evidence of being broken or too much or unable to cope with reality. It is a specific and extraordinarily rare perceptual and psychological configuration that, when understood correctly and developed deliberately, represents one of the most formidable combinations of human capacities Jung ever documented. The reason rare empaths suffer isn't the sensitivity. It is the framework through which they have been taught to understand the sensitivity. They've been handed a framework that treats depth as dysfunction, that pathologizes the inability to stay on the surface, that interprets their perceptual reality as evidence of fragility rather than as evidence of a different and more demanding relationship with the truth of human experience. Jung was direct about this in his clinical observations. The rare empath doesn't need to become less of what they are. They need an entirely different understanding of what they are, because everything that has felt like weakness, the depth, the knowing, the inability to pretend, the perception that arrives before they can explain it is not weakness dressed in sensitivity. It is the raw, unrefined material of a specific kind of strength that the world has very few names for, and that the person carrying it has very rarely been given permission to recognize in themselves. The rarest empath type isn't rare because of how much they feel. It is rare because of the specific way all those feelings are processed, perceived, organized, and ultimately made available as understanding. If you have recognized yourself in what's been described here, not all of it, perhaps, but the essential shape of it, then what is most worth understanding is this. You have not spent your life being too much. You have spent your life being something that most people around you didn't have adequate language for. Something that the standard frameworks of personality and emotion were not built to describe accurately. Something that looks from the outside like a particular kind of fragility and is, from the inside, a particular kind of perception that most people will go their entire lives without accessing. Jung did not identify this type to romanticize it. He identified it because understanding it is the prerequisite for developing it. And development, the movement from carrying these capacities unconsciously as a source of suffering to inhabiting them deliberately as a source of precision, is the entire work, not the work of becoming something different. The work of finally, accurately, without apology, understanding what you already are.